When I moved in with my grandma about 5 years ago, I wasn't sure what to expect. She'd been on her own since Grandpa passed earlier that year, and then, in my senior year of high school, she was diagnosed with dementia. That felt like a bad sign. The doctors caught it early, but they warned us that her living alone could speed up the decline. They said, people with dementia often improve or stabilize when they have company. Your mother's been alone since your father passed, and if she had someone around, it would really help her to have someone to talk to. Mom and Dad exchanged looks, not quite sure how to handle things, but they made up their minds pretty fast. With me getting ready for college and the cost of dorms out of reach, they offered a compromise. I could either live with Grandma and go to college nearby or spend some time searching for scholarships and grants to afford my own place. I'd always been close to Grandma, and she was thrilled to have me move in while I went to school. Mom and Dad didn't have to worry about me sneaking guys over or throwing parties. I wasn't the type, and they knew I'd spend most nights at home studying or resting up for the next day. So, I moved in as the school year started, which meant I was there for Halloween. Living with Grandma had been smooth sailing for the most part. We only clashed a couple of times, mainly when I got home late from class. She liked to be in bed by 9, and she didn't appreciate being disturbed. Mostly, she spent her time in bed, watching TV and knitting, but I'd pop in to chat whenever I had a chance. Some days, she recognized me as myself, and on other days, she thought I was my mom. Either way, she was never upset or confused. If she called me by Mom's name, I was Claire, and if she called me by my name, Julia, we'd just chat about our day in life in general. Through those talks, I learned a lot of family stories, secrets she thought I'd already known. I treasured that time with her while she was still mostly lucid. So, when I walked in one evening to find her putting candy in a bowl, I was surprised to see her up and about. She was huffing and puffing, looking worn out, and I wondered how she'd even gotten the candy. She didn't have a car, and I didn't remember buying any for her. When she spotted me, she lit up and held out the bowl. "Oh, Claire! There you are. I wanted to hand out candy to the kids, but I'm feeling so tired. I must be coming down with something, but I can't let the little ones down." Grandma seemed to forget that she was nearly 70 and not in the best of health. Whenever she overdid it and felt drained, she'd say she must be coming down with something, and would head to bed to recover. It was her mind's way of explaining things. Somehow, I'd forgotten it was Halloween, but Grandma hadn't. It shouldn't have been surprising, though, if anyone could remember Halloween, it was her. She'd pushed me to decorate the house earlier that month, insisted we get a pumpkin to carve, and if she'd had the strength, she would have been in costume, handing out candy herself. As it was, she'd barely managed to make it from her room to the table, and I knew it. I took the bowl from her, reassuring her I'd make sure the kids got their candy. She thanked me and headed off to bed, totally exhausted. I stepped out onto the porch, set down the bowl with a note instructing kids to take just 2 pieces, and went back inside to study. For the neighborhood kids, tonight was all about candy overload, but for me, it was all about studying for my chem midterm tomorrow. I was doing alright so far, but it was only freshman year, and my goals were way too big to risk slipping up in chemistry. I could hear the kids laughing and squealing as they made their way down the street, their footsteps tapping onto the porch, pausing as they read the 2-piece limit sign before moving on. Grandma lived in a pretty nice area, so the kids seemed used to the rule. Sure, a few probably grabbed more, but most seemed to follow it. It was dark outside, maybe around 9, when I heard a knock at the door. I looked up from my textbook, spotting a small figure in a ghost costume on the other side. Standing there quietly with a bag in hand, it looked like he'd somehow missed the bowl on the porch, or maybe he was just looking for a real trick-or-treat moment. Figuring he might need some help, I got up and went to see what he wanted. When I opened the door, there he was, a little kid wearing a bedsheet ghost costume that looked like it came straight out of an old Halloween special. His shoes poked out from underneath the sheet, and he was holding a pillowcase in one hand, a candy apple in the other. When he looked up through the eye holes in his sheet, I nearly laughed. He was like a snapshot of a Halloween from decades ago, a sort of old-fashioned memory come to life. I didn't expect him to speak, but when he did, I wished he hadn't. His voice was rough and dry, like it hadn't been used in ages, and it wiped the smile right off my face. "Is Matey here?" he rasped. It took me a second to find my voice. "No, sorry, kiddo," I managed. "There's no Matey here." He nodded slowly, turned, and walked away, his steps heavy and sad. The kid hadn't taken a single piece of candy, which struck me as odd. As I shut the door and went back to studying, a weird, creeping dread settled in my stomach that I couldn't explain. By the time the next Halloween rolled around, I'd forgotten about him. But he hadn't forgotten about us. On October 31st, I found myself once again at the table, prepping for another midterm. I was working my way through the prerequisites for biochem, hoping to start the course next year. Grandma was mostly the same, maybe a bit more tired, a bit more forgetful, but we still spent most nights together, talking or watching TV. She'd braid my hair sometimes or show me how to knit. She'd gone to bed early tonight, saying she was extra tired and didn't want to catch a cold. I'd set the candy bowl out front as usual with a note, so when I heard a knock around 8:30, I glanced up and saw the familiar little silhouette from last year. I got up, telling myself it was probably just another kid dressed as a ghost. But when I opened the door, it was him, the same sheet ghost costume, the same scuffed loafers, the same glasses outline under the sheet, and the same worn pillowcase. He hadn't changed a bit. Part of me hoped he'd remember his question from last year and wouldn't ask again. "Is Matey here?" His voice grated like before, and I had to fight a shiver as I forced a smile. "Sorry, buddy. Wrong house." He nodded solemnly and turned, his little legs carrying him down the steps and back to the sidewalk. I stood there, watching him go, wondering why he'd come back again and why he didn't seem any older. The kid looked maybe 5 or 6, but his voice sounded like it had crawled right out of the grave. For a second, I thought he might really be a ghost. But then I shook it off. It was Halloween, that's all. I went back to my books, later settling in beside Grandma when she woke up unexpectedly. We drank cocoa and watched a scary movie together, and I drifted off in the bed she once shared with Grandpa. The following Halloween, the little ghost boy came back yet again, unchanged. This time, I wanted to ask him why he kept returning after I'd told him Matey wasn't here for 2 years in a row. But when I tried to speak, the words got stuck, like there was some invisible wall between us. It felt like we were separated by a chasm, shouting over an uncrossable distance. When I stayed silent, he nodded and left, disappearing into the crowd as he always did. I didn't see him the year after that, but, to be fair, my mind was on other things. In my 4th year of college, I was just a year away from graduating and finally stepping into the world of biochemistry. I'd been heading home from campus when one of my colleagues mentioned a small party happening with some of the other TAs. Normally, I would have turned down the invitation. I wasn't much for parties and had always kept my head down in school. But I figured, maybe it was time I let myself enjoy a night off. I hadn't gone to a social event since high school, and I was a little curious to see what I'd been missing out on. I'll admit, I overindulged a bit that night. But when I got home and saw my grandma lying by the front door, any buzz I had sobered up fast. Her doctor later explained that she must have fallen while trying to get to the door, and I couldn't shake the thought that maybe she'd been trying to answer a knock from that strange little ghost boy. They kept her in the hospital for nearly 3 months, carefully monitoring her to make sure she hadn't injured herself too severely. But while she was there, her condition worsened. After a while, she either thought I was my mother or didn't recognize me at all. She started asking for someone named Albie, calling his name as if she were looking for him. I had no idea who Albie was. Mom was stumped too, though she wondered if maybe Grandma meant her father, whose name was Albert. I don't remember her ever calling him Albie, but it could have been a nickname from when they were kids, Mom had said, shrugging. Eventually, they sent Grandma home, but the doctors didn't give us much hope. They said she had maybe a year left and that she would need constant care. This time, I didn't wait for anyone to ask. I couldn't shake the guilt of not being there that night, so I took a leave from school, putting my dreams on hold to take care of her. I kept up with a few online classes to avoid falling too far behind, but mostly, I focused on being there for her. She spent her days mostly unresponsive, sometimes mumbling for Albie, or calling out to her long-gone parents, great-grandparents I had only heard about. When she did speak, she'd talk like a little girl, sharing secrets with this mysterious Albie about hidden spots and treasures only they knew about. Every morning I woke up and saw her still breathing felt like a small miracle. Despite what the doctors said, Grandma held on, and when Halloween came around again, I was in for a real shock. I'd gotten into the habit of sleeping on a cot near her bed, just in case she needed anything during the night. But one night, a loud clatter from the kitchen jolted me awake. I glanced over to make sure Grandma was still asleep, and when I saw her lying peacefully in bed, I figured she couldn't have made the noise. Another crash sounded, and without thinking, I rushed toward the kitchen, half worried that some animal had broken in. As I crept into the kitchen, I saw what looked like the furry back of a big, dark animal, maybe a cat, a dog or something even larger, poking out of a cabinet. But then it moved, and I realized it wasn't an animal at all, it was a little girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, and she was a mess. She wore a ragged black dress, pointed shoes with curled toes, and a witch's hat that she picked up from the floor. And the dirt? It wasn't really dirt, it looked like she'd dusted herself with soot from the stove. She hadn't noticed me yet. She was busy rifling through drawers and cabinets, leaving a mess behind her as she searched for something. My shock wore off just enough for me to call out, "Hey! What do you think you're doing?" The girl spun around, and as she looked me up and down, a puzzled expression crossed her face. "What are you doing here?" she asked with an indignant frown. "This is my house. You better leave before my mama catches you and gets mad." She kept rummaging through the living room, leaving books and pillows in a mess, and I trailed behind, not sure what to make of it all. It felt so real, the carpet under my feet, the faint kitchen smells, the leaky faucet dripping in the background. Yet here was this strange little girl treating my house like it was hers. She was halfway through her destruction before I shook off my unease and asked, "What exactly are you looking for?" If it's a dream, I thought, I might as well play along. "My pillowcase," she replied, hands on her hips. "The one with the pumpkin on it. I need it for Halloween, can't go trick-treating without it." I almost asked her where she'd last seen it, but then I froze as I remembered something. I knew that pillowcase. It had been sitting in Grandma's closet for years. When I offered to wash it once, she told me it had too many memories and wouldn't let me touch it. It was decorated with a hand-drawn pumpkin on one side, a black cat on the other, and a little witch's hat between them. She'd even stitched drawstrings around the top to cinch it shut, it looked like an old-timey knapsack. If this was a dream, surely Grandma wouldn't mind if I gave it to this child. "Hold on a second," I told her, "I think I know where it is." "Hurry up," she urged, "Halloween doesn't last forever." It took a bit of digging, but I found it tucked beneath some old quilts in Grandma's closet. At some point, she'd gone over the cat and hat, retracing them in charcoal, maybe to keep the memories alive. I wondered when she'd had the energy to do it, considering how frail she'd been before her fall. I brought it back to the living room and held it out to the little girl, who was leaning against the sofa with a look of pure hope. Her face lit up as she snatched it from me, hugging the bag like it was her most treasured possession. "Thank you, thank you, thank you," she cheered, hopping around in delight. "Now I can go trick-treating." And as if on cue, a gentle knock sounded at the door. The little girl dashed to open it, and I wasn't surprised to see the small ghost boy standing there. "Matey," he cried out, eyes sparkling under his sheet as she hugged him like they hadn't seen each other in ages. "Albie," she laughed. "Ready to go?" Been waiting forever, slowpoke, he teased, grinning through his mask. They took each other's hands and skipped off the porch, fading into the Halloween crowd. I watched them go, feeling a strange warmth and sense of closure fill me. Then a pang of worry hit me. I'd left Grandma alone for quite a while. I hurried back to her room, but as I looked down, I knew. She was lying too still, her skin already growing cold. I checked her pulse, hoping, but it was clear she'd been gone for hours. I felt the weight of it settle on me as I called the ambulance and then broke the news to my parents. The funeral was simple, and a week later, Mom and I went through Grandma's things. The house was mine now, and Mom was deciding what to take and what to donate. We were in her closet, sorting through a box of keepsakes, old photos, my mother's baby pictures, wedding photos of Grandma and Grandpa, and letters Grandpa had written during Vietnam. Mom joined me, smiling and tearing up as we sifted through the memories. Then, near the bottom of the box, my hands froze on a worn, black and white photo. In it, 2 children stood on the porch of a different house, grinning and in costume. One was a ghost, with glasses peeking through the sheet, and the other was a little witch, her face smudged with ashes. "Julia?" Mom asked softly, noticing my reaction. "Sweetie, you alright?" I could only nod, too stunned to speak, as I looked at the back of the photo. Written there, in faded ink, was the final piece of the puzzle. Madeline and Albert, Halloween 1960. That was the last I saw of the little witch and the ghost boy, but every Halloween since, I've kept up the decorations and left out candy, just as Grandma would have wanted. Because you never know what kind of ghosts or goblins might come calling.